Good afternoon. Today we are going to be discussing the ever-shifting shape of historical memory. Historical memory is a dynamic and fluid process and is affected by the same cultural and political, social, individual, and collective factors that we experience during the human condition as we live through history. Today we are going to speak specifically about the process of historical memory in Stalinist Russia and remembering the Reign of Terror and the Gulag, and how that process is seen in different ways through different lenses, both from the West and from within Russia, both collectively and on an individual scale. First, I'd like to point out the Wall of Grief, which is a recently dedicated monument in Moscow that speaks to the time of repression under Stalin. And essentially, it is a scythe-shaped wall that is made of human forms with no faces. There's names. The sculptor, Frangulon, describes it as a normal representative art piece, but he is looking for feelings of fear and alarm to try to represent the historical memory of this experience. This is a collective piece. This piece was commissioned by the Russian government, dedicated by Vladimir Putin, who dedicated it in the hopes that something like this would never happen again, that the remembrance would be a powerful thing, that the historical memory for the collective would be basically embodied in this sculpture, and that it would never be repeated. There's an idea that the collective erects these monuments or sanctions these or commissions them. But what is really trying to be connected to that is the individual experience at the time. That is always a very important part of collective memory, is the individual that makes it up. And oftentimes it's surprising what an individual will remember over what a collective remembers. And in fact, these are often opposing. An example of this is Stalin's sculpture of himself towering over Budapest in 1953. All that is remaining of that man's entire influence on the city, his empire, and the sphere of influence that he created with the communist resolution, and his part of the communist revolution. It has been reduced to his boots. Now all that is left is the boots of a former man who was revered and terrifying and was a murderer and a savior and all of these things. And all of these complicated ideas about a person have just been, and a leader, have been boiled down into just his boots. That's how historical memory works. There's a process of re-remembering and refocusing the past through different lenses. And some of the way that we can do this is through oral history. Oral history at times can be a kind of a contentious way of approaching history to create a historical artifact. Some of the reason for that is because of the faultiness of historical memory of individuals. However, collective historical memory can be equally faulty and can change just as dynamically. Historical memory, as far as oral history, can be a very valuable tool, especially when contextualized with written primary source documents. One of the first things that was confiscated from individuals who were being imprisoned during the Reign of Terror were diaries. Diaries, written artifacts of what was happening at the time period, because the state-sponsored information and the state-sponsored history was so controlled that really understanding what it was like to live under the Stalin regime by the ordinary person has yet to be discovered. And one of the programs that really started looking into that was the Harvard project on the Soviet social system, and that began during the Cold War in the 1950s. And it was an American program, and it essentially focused on expatriates, evacuees, people who have escaped communist Russia and were living in the United States at the time. This project used American individuals to interview these expatriates. And because of that, tends to be a little flawed in that the Americans sort of imposed their Western philosophies on their subjects when they were interviewing them. They felt that they were cagey and they didn't want to, really discuss their experiences. The individual being interviewed often offered a lot of dates and facts about their experience in the Gulag or in the labor camps or in the Reign of Terror, but very rarely were we able to know what it was like to be a part of a community, a part of a family, an individual, because these American interviewers were unable to kind of crack these Soviet expats. And some of the reason for that is that the Americans didn't terribly understand where these people were coming from or the oppressiveness of the regime that they had just been part of. The overall thematic idea about these Soviet people were that they were just liars, that they just were really good at lying and covering up the truth. And, this really speaks to this Cold War era sort of idea. The reason this project even began in the 1950s was to try to vet these Soviet expatriates and glean them for information about what it is to be a Soviet citizen so that it could be used as a tool against the Soviets during the Cold War. And so what really happens, although it is a prolific amount of information that's collected, there was about 700 interviews, there was 100 in New York alone, there were thousands of questionnaires and documents and all of this kind of compiled into this project. However, it really told more about the Americans' bias when interviewing these subjects than it did demonstrate what it was like for these people living in that regime. Another issue with this war chest of documents, which of course should be used for as a historical artifact of this time period, but recognizing where it's flawed is important. And the other drawback is that the individuals who were transcribing these interviews tended to gloss over things they found unimportant. They didn't transcribe verbatim. They transcribed from notes. And in the end, we're left with kind of half a piece of this puzzle to try to understand the Soviet experience. And so it is on the backs of this Harvard project that historian Orlando Figes began his research. And in his essay, Private Life in Stalin's Russian Family Narratives, Memory and Oral Histories, illuminates how different the perspectives of the people were once they were able to kind of gain their trust. And some of the interesting things that he finds in his research are that first, he worked with Memorial Society, just known as Memorial, which was founded in 1989, and they are a Russian nonprofit organization that is really just bent on preserving Russian history without the silencing and the historical silencing that comes from state-sponsored documents and state-sponsored historical reviews. They work with individual peoples and the individual collective to try to give a voice to the voiceless and to really discuss what happened to individuals during this reign of terror. Some of the things he found is that sometimes these individuals from Memorial, which are Russian interviewers, not American this time, are meeting with these individuals. And the oldest person interviewed, I think, was born in 1907. And then most of them were born in 1920 and followed through the mid 1950s in their remembrance of their time. So many of them spent their entire adult and growing life in this situation where Stalin was the dictator and the government. They are very distrustful of these interviewers. They come in, and sometimes it takes 10 or 15 times of meeting a person before suddenly a diary or a photograph or these historical paraphernalia, these beautiful things that have been saved, come from a secret drawer or from underneath a mattress. And so that just that display of how they kept their history is a very interesting and telling reason that the Harvard Project didn't work so well. Their findings aren't as common as you would think. First, there was several interviewees that were so afraid once they realized they'd been recorded that they said things like, "I'm never going to sleep tonight. I'm going to go back to prison." So that's how this culture of fear had been established and integrated into historical memory, even decades after Stalin had passed on and the Soviet regime had fallen and the Iron Curtain was broken. We still have individuals who were just waiting for the state to come and get them. So when the Harvard Project said that they were good at lying, they are not necessarily good at lying, but they're good at withholding information because they essentially are shaped by a society that dictated all information that it wanted. And the process of forgetting and remembering is based on these things, political factors, cultural factors, individual experience, and even names of streets and public places or monuments, or even these common things that are named in historical remembrance can be politically charged. And when you're applying that to an oral history of the individual, it becomes very important to look at how the individual has experienced this time period. Some of the very interesting things that this FIGIS research discovered was that there had been memoirs written by some expatriates. One was known, very popular, called Into the Whirlwind, written in 1968 by Evgenia Ginsburg. And she had written that. And then we have the famous Russian novelist Alexander Solzhenitsyn and his Gulag Archipelago. And both of these narratives had a very specific structure, specifically Ginsburg's, in the sense that they all start with the father or the husband being shot and assassinated by the government. And then the women are then taken to the work camps and become part of the Gulag. It talks about the relationships that are formed and the ability to survive the Gulag, and how ultimately the person is kind of forged from this crucible and comes out and remembers it a certain way. And what the interviewers realize is that many of these people being interviewed for this project actually use these memoirs as their historical memory. They remember it just like they had read in Ginsburg. And when pushed a little bit and given the context of historical documents, many of these individuals' memories kind of are jarred and they remember things a different way. And so that just goes to show how valuable both oral and written history can be. It also goes to show how that oral history cannot be censored in the way a written history can be. Written histories, autobiographical or no, can be redacted. They can be censored out of shame or fear or political pressure or even cultural pressure that they feel. So when interviewing a subject with a very good plan and a very good methodological basis, we can really glean these very interesting revelations that become such valuable historical artifacts. Many of these individuals interviewed really were afraid or ashamed to remember what exactly happened, or they created family mythologies about their parent that may or may not have been taken or could have worked for the state. So it was interesting when the interviewers would come in and provide historical documents about what had happened to their parent or their mother or father in the work camps, or how they met, or how their father was died, or what they were accused of. Oftentimes they didn't really want to accept that memory. They had created a memory based on family mythology and what they were told, oftentimes by the mother, who either didn't want to be found out and then also taken by the Russian state, or felt that they couldn't speak because of just the amount of terror and repression that they were experiencing. The other very interesting thing that was discovered in the FIGIS research is that many people, in fact, when interviewed, 42% of Russian citizens would like to have a leader like Stalin again. And this is just completely shocking and like mind-blowing after what we're looking at the wall of grief. And we know that 750,000 people were executed. Millions of people were deported or imprisoned between 1920 and 1953. This is very strange, and yet there was this memory of being part of something, being part of building the society. So even though you were in a labor camp and you were forced to work, you were proud of the city that you built. You were proud that you built this city, even though it was, and so it just shows that historical memory is this complicated thing, and that individual memory is often in opposition of collective memory. To conclude today, I'd like to point out that on December 28th, 2021, the highest court in Russia actually voted to disband the Memorial Society, the nonprofit that has been developing and curating this archive since the late 1980s to preserve historical memory. And it's just a very interesting thing that the state is again stepping in to control historical production in Russia. And thank you for your time.